Welcome back in for the Blacksburg Buzz, episode 57 today. We're doing part two of our schedule deep dive. I'm going into every single game for Virginia Tech's football season this year in 2024. We're looking in depth into every single game, who you need to be aware of, the best players on the field, how the team performed last season, how I expect them to look this season, a game plan for the Hokies, and everything else you need to know about each and every matchup coming up this fall. Now, before we get into our part two video, let's talk about today's video sponsor, BetOnline. BetOnline is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football. From the preseason NFL to college kicking off, BetOnline has every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. Think you know your stuff? Get in on our winner-take-all $300,000 NFL Survivor Pool for the upcoming season. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today and use the promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, and get in on the action. Bet online, the game starts here. So let's kick things off in our part two video. Last time, we covered the first two games of the season, Vanderbilt and Marshall. Today, we've got games 3 and 4, Old Dominion and Rutgers. Now, starting off with Old Dominion, they were 6-7 last season, and this game will be on the road in Norfolk. Now, I know that's a very hot topic around the Virginia Tech community. A lot of people see this as a pretty garbage deal for the Hokies. They're losing what could be an extra home game to play Old Dominion on the road, and in a lot of ways, I agree. It does kind of just suck in a lot of ways because you could go 7-5 in your split plus a bowl game with the home to away split, but instead you're going 6-6 in hopes of making a bowl game. Now, it doesn't bother me as much when you're going on the road to another power opponent like Vanderbilt, which is also in a really fun location. I mean, you get to go to Nashville for the weekend. There's a lot of stuff going right here. You're playing an SEC team, but playing Old Dominion every year and alternating home and away, it's a pretty weak deal for the program. They definitely should have tried to swing or amend the agreement, maybe get a 2-for-1, and, kept the deal a little bit shorter than it is. There's been rumors of a buyout as the matchup started in 2017, and it's continuing until 2031 as of right now. They didn't play in 2020 and 2021, but so far, they're still keeping this thing going. The rumors haven't really amounted to anything at the moment. And, when talking about this long series with Old Dominion, you can't not mention the loss to ODU in 2022. But frankly, I don't want to talk much more about that horrible, horrible day. That was a tough game to watch and not one I particularly want to relive. So going back to ODU, their schedule, they were 6-7 last season. Once again, I said that earlier, lost in the famous Toastery Bowl to Western Kentucky, 35-38 in overtime. Virginia Tech beat the Monarchs last season, 17-36, a pretty handy win with VT beginning the scoring with a safety, interestingly enough, and back-to-back 14-point quarters in the second and the third. They really took a commanding lead at this point. Now, something of note here, Grant Wells was still leading the team at the quarterback position during this Old Dominion game. Drones attempted just one pass, which he completed for 8 yards. Wells actually had a pretty good game, though. 251 yards, 3 passing touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown, no picks. I'd say that's pretty solid statistically. Now, don't get me wrong. You had a far superior team, and that was kind of to be expected, but not a bad game overall. Really no poor numbers there from Grant Wells in that one. And, you can't talk about that game without talking about Allie Jennings. He was eating against his former team. 2 touchdowns, 72 yards on just 5 receptions. Jalen Lane also had a pretty good game with the other receiving touchdown for the Hokies and 69 yards on 4 receptions. The team was really explosive in this matchup. A lot of big plays, including 3 guys with 30-plus yard receptions on the day, which were Jennings, Lane, and Felton. So all in all, a big win for Virginia Tech to kick off the year with Wells at quarterback, and I expect this game to be even worse this year. By this point in the season in Game 3, we're going to have a much better idea of what this Hokies team can be. But I've got all my money on Virginia Tech being, at the very least, better than they were last year. AKA, this is going to be a blowout. It was a big blowout last season, and I think it only gets worse this year. Last year, Old Dominion, they weren't great. They defeated Louisiana, Texas A&M, University of Commerce, Southern Miss, App State, Georgia Southern, and Georgia State. They had losses to Wake Forest, Marshall, JMU, Coastal Carolina, Liberty, and of course, Western Kentucky, which I mentioned in that bowl game. This season, they've got 2 really tough games to start the year with South Carolina and Virginia Tech. And then their other out-of-conference is ECU and Bowling Green before they head into that Sun Belt play. Now, this is going to be a bad team. Old Dominion probably going to be under 500 this season. They've lost a lot of good players, and that tends to happen a lot for ODU. They tend to lose a lot of their big guys, trying to take steps up into more powerhouse teams, trying to get looks at bigger programs. And that happens a lot for ODU. They lost Kadarius Callaway and Keyshawn Wicks, who both left as the top 2 rushers last season. They made up about 1,200 of the 2,000 rushing yards last season for the entire team. So that's a big portion of the team's entire rushing attack just gone right off the rip. That's not something good for this group. You really don't want to be losing your consistency. Now, on the other side, you're keeping your starting quarterback, that's pretty big in college football. Grant Wilson is staying. He had pretty good passing numbers, but the O-line is really rough for this team. Wilson, he was able to gain quite a lot of yards on the ground, 605 last season, but he had a total loss on the ground of 316. This line really needs to protect the quarterback better. I don't think they're going to be quite as bad as last year, but that's not saying much. There's really nowhere to go but up for this O-line. They returned most of the group, and they've added a few through the portal. So a little bit of help there and a little bit of improvement. You're going to see some better stuff out of Grant Wilson, which will help them quite a bit. In addition, you've got a couple of backs that we're looking at for this team. Aaron Young, a running back from Rutgers. He didn't play a lot last year with the Scarlet Knights, but 94 yards on 16 carries isn't too bad. He also picked up 24 yards on 3 receptions. Transitioning down from Rutgers to a lower tier program, he could be one of the leaders for the Monarchs and demand a lot of touches during the season. So I think he's going to be kind of one of those key guys we're going to have to look out for on the offensive side. If he has a good year, it'll help Old Dominion a lot. Other running back to be aware of from Virginia Tech, actually, Bryce Duke, 69 yards on 11 carries last season. Once again, he didn't get a lot of opportunities in the 12 games he did take the field. Old Dominion, it's going to be a better opportunity for him to get some time on the field, get some more snaps, get some more attempts, and show what he can do. But it's going to come down to a couple of these guys. They're really going to have good years and show what they can do, have good seasons to help this team out. Now, you keep 2 of the top 3 receiving threats in Kelby Williams and Isaiah Page for the Monarchs. However, they lost their top guy, Ray Mello Murphy, in terms of pure yardage. He had 502 yards for the season. Williams wasn't too far behind Murphy, however. He had 451 on the season, 2 less catches in 1 less game. So I think, Williams is going to be a big guy for the group, but I think the wide receiver one is going to be Isaiah Page. He led in targets by a pretty wide margin, 43 compared to the next highest player on the team with 29. He still had 445 yards on the season, and he only played in 11 games. So I think he's going to be that wide receiver one. The sheer volume he had last season probably speaks to that the most. He may not be quite as explosive as Kelby Williams, not quite as many yards on average in the big plays, but he gets open and he moves them down the field better. So I think Page is going to be the top guy. Now, there's one more player that you just have to mention on this ODU group. That's Jason Henderson, the Old Dominion record holder in the tackles department, 436 in his career, first team All-American by many different rankers and second team by several others. He was also first team Sun Belt. And quoting this from the roster website, he led the country in tackles per game with 14.2, and he was third in tackles for loss per game with 1.6. Henderson is a beast. He had 11 tackles last year against Virginia Tech, and he's just a monster. Simple as that. You got to watch out for this guy on defense because he's going to cause problems. Probably their top dude and one of the best in the country. Henderson puts up some crazy numbers. So he is definitely a guy to be on the lookout for during this game. Now, all in all, even with all these players, I really think Virginia Tech is just flat out the better team here. Defense, offense, I think it clears the Monarchs without much of an issue. This really isn't a team where you're looking to get a competitive game from Virginia Tech. It's not that out-of-conference opponent that it's going to be a very close one very often. We did see that stunner over the last couple of years where ODU came out on top. But generally speaking, Virginia Tech is the pretty big favorite in these matchups. And I think, once again, it's the exact same thing. The Hokies, they're going to be better than last year. They're going to be a very good team. A lot of different people across the sports world are saying this might be a team that potentially makes the college football playoff. And a team that makes the college football playoff will not be losing to Old Dominion. Simple as that. You just can't lose to ODU and have hopes quite that high unless this team really takes a dramatic step back early in the season. This isn't going to be a game I'm particularly worried about, and I think everything's going to be just fine for the Hokies. They'll cruise through this one, get out of there with a big win, and head back home to play Rutgers next week. Now, moving into this Rutgers game, this is one that I'm worried about. They were 7-6 last season, and this will be the white effect game for the Hokies this year in Lane Stadium. I think Rutgers could be a sneaky decent team, and with the Hokies playing 3 pretty easy games up to this point, I feel like this could just be that one game where Virginia Tech gets caught on their heels. Rutgers has a bye week prior to the Virginia Tech matchup, and, I got this feeling that this could be that one notable loss of the season where the team just doesn't really have it going. There's usually one unless you're a real powerhouse like Georgia or Alabama. And if I was going to pick one where the Hokies get caught off guard and get upset, I think it's going to be this Rutgers game. The offense is going to be a struggle for this Scarlet Knights team. They're set to be a little bit better than they were last year, but still that's a little shaky. Not too sure how it's going to look. They weren't the most explosive team overall, and they really struggled to get things going a lot, but their defense kept them in it pretty well. The over-under this season is at about 6 wins on DraftKings, and they've got a pretty easy Big Ten schedule this year. Now, moving back to last season, with that 7-6 record, they played 4 ranked teams in Michigan, Ohio State, Iowa, and Penn State, 3 of which were back-to-back-to-back near the end of the season. They started 3-0 with Northwestern, who was surprisingly good at 8-5, Temple, and Virginia Tech last year. They also beat Wagner, Michigan State, Indiana, and Miami in the Pinstripe Bowl before having a huge loss to Maryland right at the end of the season, and then they also lost to Wisconsin as well, who is a solid team at 7-6 additionally. But the schedule this year, it is way easier for this Rutgers team. Don't get me wrong, there's some tough games on there. They've got some big name opponents: Virginia Tech, Washington, Wisconsin, UCLA, Minnesota. But everything except for this Virginia Tech game is at home, which definitely helps you some. And I think the biggest thing about this Rutgers schedule is, while you're going to have tough games, you're going to have a lot where maybe you're not favored, but you've definitely got a solid shot at. You're avoiding the big, insane, just no chance games in favor for some that are tough but winnable, which is extremely helpful to their schedule this year. You're avoiding the top dog teams, the ones that you really got to be afraid of. You don't have them this season. So if they can just go 500 in these toss-up games, these close games, if they win the close games, I think they sneak into bowl eligibility. They're going to be a solid team. The defense will be good. They've had good groups recently, but that offense, it's got to be at least average to have a decent season. But with their schedule and a few improvements on the offensive side, I really think if they put the pieces together well, they could have a 7, maybe 8-win season. But I think 7 is probably the number I'm going for as well. I think they end up about the same as last year in terms of their win total, but I think they're a little bit better of a team, and some of these losses are going to be a lot tighter than they were last season against the likes of Michigan and Penn State. There's a couple players to watch for this team. If I'm pronouncing this wrong, I'm sorry, but it's Ethan Kaliakmanis, a quarterback from Minnesota. He's a little bit less of a rusher than Gavin Wimsatt, who was the starter last season, but I'd say he's a better pure passer quarterback, which could help this team a little bit. They didn't have a great passing attack. So with Kaliakmanis coming into the group, that might help the Scarlet Knights a little bit on the offensive side just to keep things moving, put a couple more points on the board, and maybe scratch a few extra wins onto their total. Moving into the running back room, they get their big guy from last year, Kyle Managai, leading rusher by a ton for this group. He netted 1,262 yards, had a 5.2 average per carry, and just shy of 100 yards per game. 8 touchdowns on top of that. You know that he's going to have a strong workload this year, especially with a less mobile quarterback who has to adjust into a brand new system. I really think that they're going to rely on Manangai quite a bit, particularly early in the season. They got to get that rushing attack going. And when you keep your big guy like this, who had over 1,200 yards, I think they're just going to keep cruising with him. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now, looking at the wide receiver, probably the big name here is going to be Christian Dremel, is what I'm thinking. Led the team in yards and catches last year. He shapes up to be the wide receiver 1 again this season, as a few other of the top guys aren't returning. His numbers could bump up a little bit more with Kaliakmanis, so I think Dremel's going to be a guy to watch early in the season to see how they mesh through the first 2 weeks. With having a little bit better of just a pure passing quarterback and a less mobile quarterback, I think that's going to benefit this wide receiver a lot and all the wide receivers on this Rutgers team, because you've got a guy who's looking to get you the ball quite a bit more. He's not going to be moving on his feet quite as much, and a little bit better arm, so that should bode well for all the receivers in this group. Just bump their numbers up just a hair and maybe give them a little bit more of an explosive attack. Now, shifting into the defense, which is really the big thing for Rutgers, Malcolm Ray is one of the big names, transferred from FSU, defensive lineman. Malcolm Ray is a big dude, 6'2", 292 pounds he's listed as, and he's going to cause problems. 191 total tackles last season, 2 for loss, and 2 passes deflected. He's transferring from the ACC Championship Seminoles, Ray is a good addition to an already good defense. He's going to help them out quite a bit. Another name, Flip Dixon, defensive back, 76 total tackles last season, which was good for third on the team. Dixon is a good defender who racked up tackles regardless of the opponent last season. He had a season high against Michigan with 6, and he had other big games against some other big opponents, Michigan State, Iowa, and Penn State. He had some big games, so he shows up in the big games, and he shows up in the not-so-big games. Flip Dixon is going to be a guy on the defense to be aware of during this game. Game plan here for the Hokies. I think this is by far the toughest out-of-conference game this season, in my opinion. Virginia Tech gets it at home, which definitely helps them. I think this season, the home field advantage is going to be at a level we haven't seen consistently in a long time in Blacksburg. I really think that the town and the fan base has bought into this team. They're expecting a big season, and they're going to show up and get loud. I think the home field advantage is going to be at a new level this year. The defense is probably going to dominate on both sides during this game, so I really think it comes down to who has the better offense, which I'm giving to Virginia Tech. Rutgers has a good defense, and so does the Hokies. I think this game is going to be a challenge for both sides, and it's going to be a close one, but with Virginia Tech having the better offense, they probably get the edge here. But shifting things to the other side, Rutgers has that early bye week right before this game. It gives them extra time to prep, watch film, and develop a game plan to take down VT, which should benefit the Scarlet Knights. Now, I don't want to misconstrue my opinions here. I think VT is the better team, definitely, especially on the offensive side. Rutgers has a strong defense, which I think will make this a close game, but Virginia Tech is definitely the better team in my opinion. But with how I expect Rutgers to look this year as a pretty solid Big Ten team, probably sneaking into a bowl game and making some improvements from last season, this is a game that I don't have complete, total confidence in the Hokies grabbing a win. It does worry me to some extent. Without the bye week, I'm definitely picking VT, but with that extra prep, it does make a big difference. It does make a big difference in this game. On paper, VT should get the win, but under the right conditions, I really think Rutgers has a good shot at coming out on top, which is something that I don't see happening in any of the other 3 out-of-conference games. So I'm kind of on the fence with this one. I think Virginia Tech should be the favorite team and will be the favorite team, but if there was a game early in the season, in those first 6, that I'm putting on upset watch, Rutgers is the one I would do it for. I really think they have the best shot, especially out of the 4 out-of-conference opponents, to make something happen, to make a little bit of noise here in Blacksburg. Virginia Tech's got the better group, but sometimes you're going to lose a game that you're supposed to win. That's how it goes in college. That's how it goes in the NFL. That's how it goes in sports. You can't win every single game regardless of if you're favored. I think Virginia Tech could win this one, and I think on paper they should win this one. But once again, this is a game that I have a little bit of worries about with that bye week, with the strong defense, and bringing in a couple of key additions on offense to complement the big offensive players that are staying for this group. And we could see the perfect storm where Rutgers gets the win here. So this is the game that I'm worried about. I've been worried about it for a while now, just after playing Rutgers last season. I think if any game, it's going to be this one. So definitely going to be looking at this one very closely, watching very closely, and trying to follow this Rutgers team through their first 2 games. I think that's really going to tell the tale of how they'll look for the rest of the year. And if they do play how I'm expecting them to play, then I'll be a little bit worried. If they're not quite as good as I'm projecting, I'm not too concerned about this game. So it's really one of those where it could go either way. And, under the right circumstances, I can see Rutgers taking this game. But once again, on paper, I've got Virginia Tech on top. Now, you're going to want to stay tuned in the next few weeks because we finally get our first Hokies kickoff of the season. They're heading to Vanderbilt this upcoming weekend, and boy, am I excited to get some Virginia Tech football back on my TV and back here in Blacksburg. So stay on the lookout for some great episodes. I'm going to try and schedule some good ones coming up next, and we're going to be continuing with the schedule deep dive in the coming weeks, breaking down every single game for this season, what the opponent is, how they were last year, how I think they'll look this year, game plan for the Hokies, and players to look out for. You're going to want to keep that on your Spotify, on your Apple Podcasts, on Believe.com, and on YouTube. So make sure you're tuned in for some more great episodes coming up.